Week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season is in the books, so we are headed right into week 12 of the season, so you know exactly what we need to do. We need to break down every single quarterback, every single tight end, go through every single matchup, and talk about who you should be starting and who you should be sitting in week 12. And before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 12 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 12's action. On top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 12 and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. All right, very quickly here, we have 6 teams on bye week in Week 12. Little biocalypse action. Heads up, we have another one in Week 14. Nonetheless, no Atlanta Falcons, no New York Jets, no Buffalo Bills, no New Orleans Saints, no Cincinnati Bengals, and no Jacksonville Jaguars. So plenty of quarterbacks and tight ends on bye week in Week 12. Make sure you are checking your rosters and making adjustments accordingly. All right, so let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. Our short week game of the week in Week 12 is going to be the Steelers versus the Browns. And Russell Wilson, majority of the Steelers' offensive players look like great potential starts in Week 11 against the Baltimore Ravens in a smash matchup at home. Did not quite work out. Russell Wilson just 7.3 fantasy points. Loved him as a streaming option last week, and it just was not there. 23 of 36, 205 passing yards, and 1 rushing yard. So he was not a good streaming option last week. This isn't a fantastic matchup this week against the Cleveland Browns. It's a road game here. It's a short week. I'm just going to stay away from Russell Wilson this week. I don't think that you particularly have to drop him per se, but just not my favorite start this week, and I don't want to view him as a potential streaming option as the Browns are giving up the 15th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, so I'm going to stay away unless you're absolutely desperate in like a double quarterback superflex type format due to bye weeks. Now, looking at Pat Freiermuth, he does have a good matchup as the Browns are allowing the 25th most fantasy points to the tight end position. He was another player that I really liked as a potential streaming option last week against the Ravens, and, well, he also did not come through, just 3.4 fantasy points, but I'm going to go ahead and leave him in that streaming category. If you're desperate, you need a tight end to roll with this week. I think Pat Freiermuth has a chance to get you through. It's been very inconsistent over the past couple weeks, but this is another good matchup, so not my favorite streaming candidate at the tight end position, but if you need somebody and you're desperate, I would say I like his chances more than Russell Wilson. Now, moving along to the Browns, Jameis Winston might surprise you guys. I have him as a sit. I will admit I wasn't very high on him last week. He did come through for you with 26.6 fantasy points, 30 of 46, 395 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 8 rushing yards. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, Jameis Winston has some stream appeal. I would probably start Jameis Winston before Russell Wilson in this type of circumstance, but we have to keep in mind the Steelers are allowing the second fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. They've been very stout against the quarterback position throughout the season. They just gave Lamar Jackson his worst fantasy outing of the entire season. I'm going to stay away from Jameis Winston. I know that the Browns are going to throw the football first and foremost. Jameis Winston has 41 or more passing attempts in 3 straight starts, but short weeks, feels like one of those nitty-gritty divisional matchups here. Good defenses for the most part, at least a good defense with the Steelers. I just want to stay away from this matchup for the most part, and I just don't feel great about Jameis Winston. Desperation stream at best. I will say, though, I do like David Njoku coming off of a big game. We saw a lot of volume to the wide receivers on this team, but David Njoku still 9 targets, 9 catches, 81 receiving yards, and 19.1 fantasy points. The Steelers giving up the 16th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. It's a good enough matchup. But David Njoku is dealing with a knee injury. He is technically on the injury report at this point in time, so just monitor that throughout the week. But if he ends up playing, I'm good with starting David Njoku here in Week 12. All right, next up, we got a gross one. Let's take a look at the Titans traveling to face the Strouds and the Texans, whatever we want to call them these days. Listen, our first matchup on Sunday here. Let's just start with the Titans side of things. Will Levis has been better by Will Levis standards. I mean, just one turnover in these last two starts compared to a multitude of turnovers in his first 5 starts on the season, but still not going to be fantasy relevant. 16.6 fantasy points in Week 11, 17 to 31, 295 passing yards, a passing touchdown, a pick, and 18 rushing yards. So I just don't feel very good about this one. It's not a bad matchup. The Texans are giving up the 22nd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but I just don't see any real reason why you would need to start Will Levis. You'd have to be beyond desperate in a deeper super flex type format to even consider this, but let's just stay away. I know we got a lot of bye weeks, and so far I haven't given you a lot of streaming candidates, but I just don't feel good about this one. In terms of any tight end on the Titans, there's just nothing here. Chicken Conquo, 3.9 fantasy points this past week. Josh Weil, 1.6. Nothing to look at here in terms of Titans tight ends. Now, CJ Stroud, we've been kind of on the fence. Like I've talked about it the past couple weeks. Like he's right there in terms of being a sit, and then we kind of keep rolling with it. Week 10, left him as a start because it was a good matchup against Detroit, good game script, primetime game. Wasn't there this past week. I left him as if you need to, you can start him. Wasn't quite a sit. But I told you guys I was only doing that because it's a great matchup against the Dallas Cowboys. And 11.8 fantasy points is all we can muster up. I know the big touchdown to Nico was called back early in the game. Listen, this is not a bad matchup for Stroud either, as the Titans are right below the Texans, giving up the 21st most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. But, I mean, what am I supposed to do? I mean, we got Stroud with 12.4 or less fantasy points in every game since Week 7. He's just off the start streaming radar for me. I mean, there's just nothing here. He's the QB 17 on the season. We're far removed from those slight higher ceilings that we saw between weeks 4 and 6 with 16 or more fantasy points. I mean, it just hasn't been good. If you're a CJ Stroud owner, you are beyond disappointed at this point in the season. And once again, like, it's a good matchup. It's a even better matchup in Week 13 against Jacksonville, but I just don't think we can have any confidence in starting CJ Stroud at this point in the season. So, listen, you're desperate, super flex, double quarterback. Sure, you could take the matchup, but beyond that, I'm just done at this point in the season. Maybe we can come back against the Jacksonville Jaguars next week if this week goes well, but I have no confidence in telling you guys to start or stream CJ Stroud this week. Dalton Schultz has been a little bit better the past 2 weeks. I guess you could look at the past 4 weeks. He has 8.3 or more fantasy points in 3 or 4 matchups, but the ceiling's so incredibly low here. I have no interest in Dalton Schultz. The Titans giving up the 7th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, so this is just another situation I'm staying away from. Don't love this matchup for quarterbacks and tight ends as we head into Week 12. Next up, we got a divisional matchup between the Vikings and the Bears. So let's start with Sam Darnold. Kind of put him back in that streaming category last week. I know there were some concerns. 3 interceptions and a smash matchup against the Jags in Week 10. 2 interceptions, a lost fumble in Week 9, and another good matchup against the Colts. But ultimately, Sam Darnold has been very good over the past couple weeks, right? Double digits, well, that's expected from a quarterback. 17.2 or more fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 matchups. Just kind of the, bummer game, head-scratching game, turnovers in the red zone game against the Jaguars, but it is what it is. I mean, he's been very good still on the entirety of the season. He's your quarterback 12 so far, 17 or more fantasy points in every game on the season except for 3. So Listen, this isn't a fantastic matchup. The Bears are allowing the fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position, so I'm going to leave him in that streaming area. I'm still okay with him, but I don't want to quite put him as like a start because this is a bad matchup. This is the worst possible matchup that you could get. So kind of depends on who you have here, but he is a startable player at the quarterback position for sure. Then we look at TJ Hawkinson. I mean, this is also not a fantastic matchup for Hawkinson, not the worst matchup, but the Bears allowing the 13th fewest fantasy points to tight end. So, I mean, I think what really happened with Hawkinson is like we pumped the brakes in week 9, first game back, didn't expect a whole lot. Then in week 10, he gets that smash matchup. I mean, the Jags have been allowing great fantasy stat lines to the tight end position all season long. He had 15.2 fantasy points in week 10. Then this past week, tougher matchup against the Titans, kind of came back to earth, right? 3 targets, 2 catches, 13 receiving yards, 3.3 fantasy points. So I do think we're going to get some inconsistency out of TJ Hawkinson. I think that, it was very easy to read into that week 10 stat line. Like he got great volume, came through with the 15.2 fantasy points, but I think we need to kind of tamper our expectations with Hawkinson moving forward. So we'll see what happens here. I'll leave him in that streaming area, but he is not my favorite streaming option per se here in week 12. Let's move along to the Bears. Caleb Williams looked better this past week with the change at offensive coordinator. Didn't throw any touchdowns, didn't run for any touchdowns, but everything else was very good. So, I mean, he only had 16.2 fantasy points, but you factor in that there's no touchdowns involved here. That's pretty good given the circumstances. 23 of 31, 231 passing yards. Then what was really nice was seeing more of that rushing ability out of Caleb Williams. 9 rushes for 70 rushing yards, his best mark in that category on the season. Now, this is a tough matchup going up against the Minnesota Vikings, giving up the 11th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and they tend to kind of game plan well. And I do think this could be a tough outing for Caleb Williams, but we saw some life this past week, and we know that the Vikings have still somewhat struggled against the wide receiver position. We saw a pretty decent outing out of all 3 wide receivers on the Bears this past week, at least compared to recent weeks. So, listen, I think there's some life here for Caleb Williams and company, but I don't want to get too carried away here. He's a streaming option, but maybe tamper your expectations due to the matchup. Now, Cole Kmet showed some life this past week as well. 7.2 fantasy points. That was much better than the 4.4 or less fantasy points he had in the previous 3 weeks. He is a tight end 12 on the season. I mean, he's done some things, but kind of mainly in that stretch of soft matchups when the Bears look good. The Vikings giving up the 9th fewest fantasy points to tight ends, so I was kind of close to maybe putting Kmet in the streaming category. He's a desperation stream at best, but I think for majority fantasy owners, I'm going to go ahead and sit him. I don't really see like nice touchdown upside for him in this game whatsoever, and it's just not a great matchup. So I'm going to stay away from Kmet this week, and I do think we have some streaming options at quarterback and tight end in this matchup in week 12. Moving along, another divisional matchup, and it's the Cowboys traveling to face the Commanders. Cooper Rush. I mean, let's give Cooper Rush some flowers here. 32 of 55. The Cowboys kept slinging the football, running plays till the very last second. 354 passing yards, a touchdown, a pick, 2 rushing yards. For what it's worth, he did have 17.3 fantasy points. So there's that. He's going to get the Washington Commanders this week. So I think I'm still staying away here. I will say that the Commanders are giving up the 20th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but I just don't feel good about this one. I'm not going to read too much into those 17 fantasy points, but at least we saw some life, so to speak, out of the Cowboys, and they still basically got blown out. Moving along, though, Jake Ferguson, concussion ruled out early in that matchup against the Houston Texans on Monday Night Football. Finished with just 2.1 fantasy points, so his status, of course, up in the air for this week. But if he does not play, Luke Schoonmaker is interesting. I left him as a sit because, once again, I don't want to read too much into Week 11. We know that the Texans defensive unit has a soft secondary, although they are good up front. Shoemaker, though, got 10 targets, 6 catches, 56 receiving yards, 11.6 fantasy points. He's 0% rostered. Kind of two factors here. First, we got to figure out, is Ferguson going to play or not play? Then the second factor would be, like, is this a one-week anomaly due to game script? Hard to say here. So I'm going to stay away from Shoemaker, but I will say if you find yourself end of the week in a very desperate situation and Ferguson is ruled out officially, Shoemaker probably has some streaming appeal here against the Commanders this week. They are only giving up the 12th most fantasy points to the tight end position, so not a fantastic matchup, but I do think he's an interesting name to watch as the week progresses. Let's move along to the Washington Commanders. Jaden Daniels coming off of a 14.4 fantasy performance. That is now 14 or less fantasy points in 2 straight games. 22 of 32, 191 passing yards, a tutty, a pick, 18 rushing yards. He now has 18 or less rushing yards in 2 straight games. So, listen, I'm not going to overreact here. I think this is a good matchup, good potential game script. The Commanders in need of a win here. The Cowboys giving up the 28th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. This is still your QB6 on the season. I know it's been a little bumpy over the past couple weeks, but we're not that far removed from a 19.8 fantasy day in week 9 and a 22.2 fantasy day in week 8. So I would keep rolling with Jaden Daniels. No reason to bench him this week. Smash matchup, divisional matchup. The Commanders need to bounce back, get a strong win this week. And we've talked very positively about Zach Ertz on the channel throughout the course of the season. Also been a little bit bumpy in some of those down performances from Jaden Daniels, but ultimately he's been very good. 10 or more fantasy points in every game but 2 since week 6, 7.1 or more in every game except for 1 since week 6. Scored his 2nd touchdown of the year in week 11. In garbage time against the Eagles, nonetheless, 7 targets, 6 catches, 47 receiving yards. That touchdown, 18.7 fantasy points was his best mark on the season. He's a tight end 11 so far in the season. I would keep rolling with Zach Ertz. The Cowboys right there, kind of close to the middle, giving up the 15th most fantasy points to tight ends. We'll take it. Zach Ertz, a strong start. Jaden Daniels, a strong start. And let's stay away from the Cowboys here in week 12. Moving along, more divisional matchups. Let's take a look at the Patriots, who will travel to face the Dolphins. And let's talk a little Drake May here. So, listen, Drake May has been serviceable in fantasy football for the most part in the past couple weeks. We got a bad performance in week 8, but he had to leave that game early. Can't really hold it against him. Bad performance against the Bears in week 12, but that's a very tough matchup. Outside of that, in all of his starts, 17.7 or more fantasy points. Okay stat line in week 11, 18.9 fantasy points, 30 of 40, 282 passing yards, 2 tutties through the air, and an interception, then 27 yards on the ground. He did have a lost fumble as well, so he has had a few turnovers in the past couple weeks, 2 lost fumbles and 4 interceptions, and I was close to considering him as a streaming option given the bye weeks this week, but this Dolphins pass defense has been nothing to sneeze at. They're allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, so desperation streaming category is still there for Drake May, but I want to avoid him on the road due to this matchup in week 12. Hunter Henry, on the other hand, one of our top streaming options at tight end on the channel going into week 11, 9 targets, 6 catches, 63 receiving yards, 12.3 fantasy points. So we look back to week 6, Hunter Henry, double digits every single game except for week 8 when Drake May had to leave early and he barely missed the mark with 9.5 fantasy points. And in week 10 against the Chicago Bears, once again, a tough matchup. But with Drake May at the starting quarterback position, we're getting double-digit performances out of Hunter Henry. Not a very high ceiling per se, but the double digits are there, and that's enough for me. So I will roll with Hunter Henry again as a strong streaming option, as the Dolphins are giving up the 20th most fantasy points to the tight end position, and Brock Bowers just had a day against them. So Hunter Henry, my favorite streaming option at tight end, I think, so far on the video. Then moving along to the Dolphins, Tua Tagovailoa very good fantasy day in week 11, his best on the season, 25.3 fantasy points, 28 of 36, 288 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. Did have a fumble, but it was not a lost fumble, so no turnovers, no interceptions, no rushing yards as well. He gets the New England Patriots this week. It's not the greatest matchup. This Patriots defense has quietly been pretty good, giving up the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but I will go ahead and leave Tua in the streaming category. If it was a better matchup, I might have him closer to a start, but based on the fact that it's not as good of a matchup this week, I'll leave him as a streaming option, and we'll just kind of leave it at that, though. I do think he's a strong streaming option, but like I said, this Patriots defense, not as bad as you may think. Now, Jonnu Smith is basically the wide receiver 2 on this team. I mean, in the pecking order, it's going Hill, Smith, A-Chain, Waddle, Beckham, whoever next, right? So Jonnu Smith has moved up to the tight end 9 on the season, having a monster day against the Raiders in week 11. 8 targets, 6 catches, 101 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. Monster day. He has had 6 or more fantasy points in every game since week 5. He's had double digits in every game except for 2 since week 5. So he's very involved in this offense. It's not a great matchup this week as the Patriots are allowing the 11th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. But I think at this point in the season, we just got to consider Jonnu Smith a strong start. And I think he's kind of beyond that streaming category. He sits at 56% rostered. I think that number is going to shoot up pretty drastically this week. So if he's out there and available, you have a tight end on bye, Jonnu Smith is a must-add player at the position and a strong start in week 12. Moving along, we got the Chiefs coming off of their first loss on the season, traveling to face the Carolina Panthers. So let's start with the Chiefs side of things. Patty Mahomes been better over the past month, 16 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games. By Mahomes standards on the season, that is good. Kind of crazy to say. Week 11, he was 23 of 33, 196 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 2 interceptions. You don't really want to hold the last interception against him in terms of the fantasy day, but it was there nonetheless. Desperation throw at the end of the game. It was still there, right? So he was close to having a 20 fantasy point day, but nonetheless, he did not. So what do we do with him in a strong matchup against the Panthers, who are giving up the 26 most fantasy points to quarterbacks? I'm probably still sticking with Patty Mahomes this week. Travis Kelce, though, coming off of a very poor performance, and we've seen some bad performances out of Kelce on the season. This was his second worst in a big game. Good game script. 4 targets, 2 catches, 8 receiving yards, 2.8 fantasy points. But the Panthers have struggled mightily against the tight end position so far on the season. They are giving up the second most fantasy points, 31st against the position so far on the season. So if you own Kelce, I would go ahead and roll with him. I don't think there's any reason to bench Kelce. We've been talking pretty positively about Kelce, like dating back to weeks 3 and 4. And I just think you kind of roll with the punches. You're not getting, this really safe floor every week and these high ceilings every single week like we're used to. But, he's a top 10 tight end on the season. I think you just roll with the punches here and you start him. Now, Noah Gray coming off of a career day, 2 touchdowns, 5 targets, 4 catches, 23 receiving yards, 18.3 fantasy points. I do have him in the sit category because I don't want to read too much into 1 week here. He has done some other things throughout the week. We've talked about Noah Gray in previous weeks on the channel, but it's been really inconsistent. We date back to week 7, 10.6, 5.3, 0, 3.8, 18.3. Just not a lot of consistency. You never really know what the Chiefs and Andy Reid are going to do on a weekly basis, but this is a great matchup. And if you find yourself, due to bye weeks, in a desperate situation at the end of the week, he sits at 4% rostered. He might have some stream appeal, but it is a very risky situation. So I think I would stay away from it, but it is a little interesting. All right. Then we got Bryce Young coming off of a bye week. We're not going to start Bryce Young. I mean, he's been better, by Bryce Young standards, but the fantasy stat lines are not there. He has not had more than 15.5 fantasy points in a game, 12 or less in his last 2 starts. Tough matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs this week. I mean, they have been pretty soft in fantasy against opposing quarterbacks, giving up the 23rd most points, but I don't feel good about this situation, so I will stay away. Now, Ja'Tavion Sanders, I left as a sit, but once again, I mean, this Chiefs defense hasn't been necessarily fantastic against tight ends, to say the least, giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the position. So he sits at 9% rostered. This is a player that if the week progresses and you're desperate, he has some stream appeal, but I'm kind of gone back and forth with this matchup. I have one of those feelings this Chiefs defense is going to come through. Not going to be a great day for the Panthers, but Ja'Tavion Sanders does have 8.8 or more fantasy points in every start but one since week 6. So good matchup on paper. If you find yourself desperate, he might get you enough points to get through the week, but I would avoid the situation if you can. Moving along, we have the Buccaneers traveling to face the Giants. Let's talk a little Baker Moneymaker Mayfield, who's coming off of a bye week in week 11 and coming off of 2 fantasy performances that were a little bit below Baker Mayfield's standards. I mean, 18 fantasy points in week 9 against the Chiefs with no wide receivers was fine, but 8.9 in week 10 against the Niners was not as encouraging to see after having 23.4 or more fantasy points in every game since week 4. But nonetheless, Mike Evans coming back this week. Things are going to change. Baker's going to be back. So the Giants allowing the 19th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. I'm going to put Baker in the start category. I think he's going to be much better than we saw in that last matchup against the Niners, and bye weeks, all that stuff this week. Go ahead and fire up Baker Mayfield. He is a strong start. Then we look to Cade Otton. Remember him? He's also been just a fantastic start over the, past couple weeks and everything. And I think some people are going to look at this and say, I don't know, Mike Evans is back. Don't worry about Mike Evans' return to this offense. I will say, if I'm going to worry about anything, it's the matchup. The Giants, surprisingly, have given up the fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends thus far on the season. So I guess that's there, but I'm not going to read too much into this. The volume should be great. Otton has 6 or more targets in every game since week 3, except for week 5 against the Falcons. So 8 or more targets in 4 straight games, 3 of those with 10 or more targets. So let's keep rolling with Cade Otton, and he's kind of still in that area of I think you can flex Cade Otton. I think he gets enough volume and will be enough involved even with the return of Mike Evans. So Baker Mayfield, Cade Otton, I feel good about both of these players coming off their bye week going into week 12. Now, we also have the Giants coming out of their bye week with some changes, and we will be looking at Tommy DeVito as a starting quarterback. I think a lot of people thought it would be Drew Lock if we weren't going to see Daniel Jones starting. So, listen, I'm not going to start Tommy DeVito this week, and I think a lot of people are looking at this situation, kind of chuckling and everything. DeVito as a starter last year, 17.4 or more fantasy points in 2 games. Outside of that, 14.5 or less in every other start. He did get some wins sprinkled in there too, and then things started to kind of quickly fall off around week 15. Nonetheless, here, this is a great matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So they are giving up the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. This is a home game as well. But I'm not going to risk this. But all I'm saying is we might walk out of week 12 a little bit surprised about what we see out of Tommy DeVito in terms of a fantasy stat line or an overall stat line, kind of like, Cooper Rush still ended up giving a respectable stat line on Monday Night Football with 17 fantasy points. At the same time, I could see this just being completely awful. So we'll find out. I do like Tommy DeVito. It is a fun situation. All right, and you guys are going to call me crazy for this one, but I like Tommy DeVito to throw one touchdown against this very poor Bucs secondary here in Week 12. I think this is a sneaky line on Underdog. Great matchup against the Bucs. We look back to last year, Tommy DeVito had at least one passing touchdown in his first 5 starts with the Giants. So even if it's in garbage time, I think DeVito can get this one done. I think this is a nice sneaky line on Underdog. So you know what to do. Head straight to Underdog. Take the over on DeVito to throw a passing touchdown. And all new users on Underdog who sign up with promo code TheCatch are going to get that free NFL Pick'em. Take this line for DeVito. Once that hits, and once your free Pick'em hits, you're going to triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, you're also going to get a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Theo Johnson has been okay. I mean, 6.5 or more fantasy points in his last 3 games. 6 or more fantasy points in every game since Week 5, except for a goose egg in Week 7. So there's some potential for points. The Bucs have struggled against opposing tight ends. They're giving up the 28th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So the matchup is here once again. But, you know, while there's that kind of chemistry between Daniel Jones and Theo Johnson, I don't know if it's going to bleed over to the new quarterback situation with Tommy DeVito. So that's what makes me more hesitant here. But, you know, Ja'Tavion Sanders, Theo Johnson, like these are the type of players, very lowly rostered, that if you get in a desperate situation at the end of the week, you can look at the matchups here, look at the fact that you can probably grab them off the waiver wire and plug them in and hope for 6, 7, 8 fantasy points. So there's some stream appeal, but the upside's very low. So we'll see what happens here. This will certainly be an interesting matchup to watch in Week 12. Next up, we have the Lions traveling to face the Colts. And let's start with Jared Goff coming off of a 34.5 fantasy day in Week 11, his best of the season. 24-29, 412 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, 21 yards on the ground. The Lions refusing to take their foot off the gas against arguably the worst team in the NFL. And that was a great thing for fantasy owners because I think the first 3 touchdowns were 2 to Monty and 1 to Gibbs, all on the ground. And then you're like, oh, man, like, yeah, this game's over. We're not going to see Goff do anything if you started him. And Dan Campbell had different plans. Nonetheless, I think Goff is a strong start once again here in Week 12 on the road, going up against the Colts, giving up the 24th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. So there has been some inconsistency over the past couple weeks. I mean, 15.5 or less fantasy points in 3 straight games for Goff before this past week's explosion. But it's just kind of hard to sit Goff when we know how high the ceiling is. And I think this game against the Colts could be surprisingly competitive. So I think Goff is a strong start this week. But understand, we have seen inconsistency over the past couple weeks with Goff. Then looking at the tight ends here. So Sam Laporta missed this past week. We saw Brock Wright come in, caught one of those 4 touchdowns against Jacksonville in Week 11 that Goff threw. That was his only catch on the day. The Jags have been awful against tight ends and awful against everything. So what do we do here? Well, we kind of got to sit back and see if Laporta plays. I would feel far more comfortable starting Laporta than Brock Wright. I don't think Wright is going to do enough. But this is a great matchup. The Colts giving up the 27th most fantasy points to tight ends. So, you know, maybe there's stream appeal here if Laporta's out, but we kind of just got to monitor this situation as the week goes on and Laporta deals with that shoulder injury. If Laporta starts, I think he's a good start. Right, kind of in that desperation stream category. I want to avoid him if possible, but the matchup is there. All right, Anthony Richardson, his first game back as a starter, benched for 2 weeks. Came back, looked very good. 20 of 30, 272 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 32 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns. Did have 2 fumbles, one of them lost, but finished the day with 28 fantasy points. Looked much more in control of this offense. There were some shaky moments here and there, passing early in the game, and the 2 fumbles, all of that, but he looked much, much better, much more comfortable. Albeit that was against the Jets defense who some people still think about this Jets defense like, oh, they're good they're not a good defense. I've been saying it for weeks and weeks now. Nonetheless, what do we do against the Lions this week? Very different defense that still has its own problems, but they're giving up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So I have Richardson in the streaming category due to Biocalypse and all this stuff going on, but yeah, I will say he gets an asterisk because he's not my favorite streaming option. We don't want to read a ton into one performance here. We have a good performance in week 1 against Houston, right? And then 12.8 or less fantasy points in every other game except for this past week. So I want to be careful with this one. I think he's worth rostering. He sits at 44% rostered. It's not particularly a great strength of schedule. The Lions this week, the Patriots, an inconvenient bye week in week 14, the Broncos, the Titans before finishing the season with the Giants, which is positive. But yeah, I'm going to be careful with this one. He's in the streaming category, but proceed with caution going into week 12. All right, next up we have the Broncos, who will travel to face the Raiders. And we have been talking up Bo Nix for weeks, and now it's all of a sudden trendy to talk about Bo Nix and look at Bo Nix versus Jaden Daniels and all of this stuff. We have been talking about Bo Nix as a start, as a solid stream, dating back to weeks 5 and 6 of the season. Go back and find the videos and all of that. And we've been Bo Nix believers on this channel for quite some time. We declared it was Bo Nix season going into week 9, and he kind of somewhat came back to earth, but was still a decent streaming option that week. But I think at this point, people are realizing Bo Nix is playing good football overall. 16 or more fantasy points in every game except for 3 so far on the season. He has, except for 4, my mistake. He has 16 or more fantasy points in every game except for 1 since week 5. A ceiling of 29.7 fantasy points on the season. He was one of our top streaming options at the position going into week 11. 28 of 33, 307 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, 5 rushing yards. We have kind of seen that rushing, ability kind of be a little bit more haltered as of late, but he's the QB7 on the season. Bo Nix, a strong start again here in week 12 as the Raiders are giving up the 25th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. He has moved up, to 60% rostered. If he's out there and available, love him this week, and I like him next week against the Browns before he gets a week 14 bye. Bo Nix should be rostered. He's no longer a streaming type player. Maybe we'll look at some of the tougher matchups like the Chargers in week 16. Maybe move him in that category, but outside of that, he's a start the rest of the season, and it's time that you start Bo-leaving. And it feels like every single week we are choosing Bo Nix as our pick for Underdog Pick Ems, but his line again sitting at 220.5 passing yards on Underdog in another smash matchup. He has hit this in 2 of the last 3 games, barely missed it by 6 yards against the Chiefs. This is another smash line on Underdog, so I would be heading straight to Underdog to take the over on Bo Nix's passing yards. Don't forget, new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 12. Take your free Pick'em, pair it with Bo Nix's total passing yards. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, when you sign up on Underdog with promo code THECATCH, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. All right. Any tight ends on this team, though, you don't need to believe in. They are absolute garbage. And Nate Adkins did score a touchdown this past week, but like everyone on this team scored a touchdown this past week. He had 0 fantasy points in the 2 previous weeks. Lucas Krull, Adam Trotman, anybody else, just stay away from the tight end position on this team. Now, let's take a look at the other side of things here. Gardner Minshew put up his best fantasy outing in Week 11 against a good Miami Dolphins defense. 30 of 43, 282 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, a pick, 7 yards on the ground, 18.9 fantasy points. So congrats to Gardner Minshew for doing that, but this is a tough matchup here against the Broncos. I just don't think you should try and risk this whatsoever. I don't think I need to break this down a ton here. It's another tough matchup against the Chiefs in Week 13, so staying away from Gardner Minshew until we see some sort of consistency emerge. No interest there. Now, consistency would lie with Brock Bowers, who's the tight end 2 on the season. 31.3 fantasy points in Week 11. 16 targets, 13 catches, 126 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He has been balling out in his rookie season, and this was his highest fantasy performance on the season. 2 double-digit performances on the season, has a bye week, and he is your tight end 2 on the season. Has already had his bye week is what I was trying to say there. Outside of that, double digits in every other game. He's been fantastic. Don't need to break this down a ton. It's not a fantastic matchup this week, but it doesn't matter. You're starting Brock Bowers if you own him here in Week 12. Moving along, let's take a look at the Cardinals coming off of their bye week, traveling to face the Seattle Seahawks. Kyler Murray, top 10 quarterback in fantasy. We've seen some inconsistency out of Kyler, to say the least. The Seahawks right there in the middle, giving up the 16th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Not a great matchup, not a bad matchup, but this defense has been really wishy-washy throughout the season. Kyler has 22 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2 since Week 5. And in those 2 games, he did not score double digits. He had 11.9 fantasy points in Week 6 and 4.7 in Week 9. But I just feel like you got to start Kyler. I mean, the upside is 28 fantasy points, and the floor has been rough, but the Cardinals have been putting together some interesting game plans. Like, it wasn't a good matchup against the Bears. They ran the football a ton against the Bears. Amari DeMarcado, Trey Benson, James Conner, everybody, right? So, listen, I'm not too concerned about Kyler. It's been a pretty tough stretch of games here. Some good defenses, the Niners, Washington, Green Bay, the Chargers, Miami, Chicago. And I think it'll start to clean up a little bit here over the next couple weeks from a fantasy perspective. So, I would roll with Kyler if you own him. Roll with the punches. I think he's a good start this week. And, Trey McBride has been as good as anybody at the tight end position on the season. 2 single-digit performances. Missed Week 4. Has had his bye week, and he's a tight end 6. Outside of those games, double-digit fantasy performances for McBride in every single matchup. So if you own McBride, we're not thinking twice about this. We're starting him here in Week 12. Now, we look at Geno Smith and the Seattle Seahawks. I was close to putting Geno in like a streaming category. He is the quarterback 11 on the season. 16 fantasy points this past week, 25 of 32, 221 passing yards, a pick, and 29 yards on the ground. And then that would turn into the game-winning touchdown at the end, rushing touchdown. So the Cardinals, kind of close to the middle, 14th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. And this defense has started to look a lot better. They're kind of humming right now. So I'm avoiding Geno Smith this week. And I think for the most part, you're probably not going to be in a position, even with the bye weeks, where you have to start Geno. He could be a start, but I don't want to go near this one, so I'm going to stay away here. Now, Noah Fant has missed the last 2 weeks. We should really have A.J. Barner's name also up on the screen. He's been the starting tight end the past 2 weeks. 4 targets, 2 catches, 15 receiving yards, 3.5 fantasy points in Week 11. But regardless of if it's A.J. Barner or Noah Fant or both tight ends, I'm just staying away from the tight end position when it comes to the Seattle Seahawks, and I think everyone out there watching this is going to do the same. There's much, much stronger options that we've gone over through the video if you need a streaming option at tight end here in Week 12. Next up, we have the Niners, who will travel to face the Packers. And let's talk about Brock Purdy, who has now popped up on the injury report dealing with right shoulder soreness. He is considered day-to-day. So what do we do with Purdy in a tough matchup this week, as the Packers are giving up the 8th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks? I still find it difficult to bench Brock Purdy as he has had 19.3 or more fantasy points in 5 straight starts. If the shoulder injury starts to become more of a concern as the week progresses, then we can take a look there. But I would expect there's going to be a push for Purdy to play this week as this Niners team desperately needs some wins, and they have 2 tough games on the road in the next 2 weeks against the Packers this week and then the Bills the following week. So I'm going to leave Purdy as a start. I know it's not a great matchup here. May depend on who else you have, but the game script should be here. Now, Kittle missed week 11 dealing with a hamstring injury, but he is expected to start practicing again this week, and I'm going to go ahead and guess that he's going to play this week. So if you own Kittle, don't be too concerned here. Looks like he's going to practice, get back into the swing of things, and should play in week 12. And if Kittle plays, you just can't bench him. He's your tight end 1 on the season. He has a single-digit performance in week 1. He's had his bye week, and he's missed 2 games. He still has outperformed every other tight end on the season. So go ahead and keep rolling with George Kittle. Then we move along to the Packers here. Jordan Love coming off of a 21.2 fantasy day in a tough matchup against the Chicago Bears. 13 of 17, 261 passing yards, a touchdown, a pick, 18 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown, as well as a lost fumble. But all that gets lost in the fantasy world because he had over 20 fantasy points. So Jordan Love, I think we just keep rolling with the punches here. It is a tough matchup against the Niners, allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points to the position, but I will continue to roll with Jordan Love if I own him. Same with Brock Purdy. Like, these are the type of players that you just kind of keep rolling with the punches, right? All right, Tucker Kraft, though. Can we keep rolling with the punches here? I don't know. 1 target, 0 catches, goose egg. In week 11, and a tough matchup against the Bears. They do a very good job against the tight end position. So this week he gets the Niners giving up the 6th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. So I almost put him as a sit. I think he is still streamable. He sits at 76% rostered. I won't be surprised if that number drops. We have talked a lot over the past couple weeks, like dating back to week 4, about Tucker Kraft and how he is solely touchdown dependent. He only has double-digit performances in games where he scores touchdowns. Very difficult to call when he's going to score those touchdowns. So, listen, he still has stream appeal. It's not a great matchup, but the game script should be here as a big game for both teams involved. So he is streamable, but he's definitely not my favorite streaming option. But if he does score a touchdown, then he's probably going to come through with double digits for you. So proceed with caution with Tucker Kraft, but he is definitely still a startable player here in week 12. Next up, we're looking at the Eagles, who will travel to face the Rams on Sunday Night Football. So let's start with the Eagles side of things. I think we have 2 solid starts here. I know Hurts played a little bit down in week 11, but he still got you 18 fantasy points. I mean, there's still people like finding ways to criticize Jalen Hurts from a fantasy perspective, but he has 16 or more fantasy points in every game this year except for week 3. 18 or more fantasy points in every game this year except for 2. And he has 20 or more fantasy points in every game this year except for 4. He's your QB3 on the season. That rushing capacity is coming back in. The rushing touchdowns are here. A rushing touchdown in every game since week 7. He's been great. Don't be overly concerned for any reason about Jalen Hurts. Saquon Barkley is going to get his. It is what it is. There's going to be weeks where Hurts has more rushing touchdowns than Barkley and vice versa. Nonetheless, both are fantastic starts, and Hurts is a strong start this week in a primetime matchup against the Rams. Dallas Goedert, some people a little bit concerned, like, is he even a startable player because the volume was so low in week 10. The touchdown was essentially the only reason he had a double-digit performance in week 10. Then he came through with 5 targets, 5 catches, 61 receiving yards in week 11, 11.1 fantasy points. So that's 10 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games, 10 or more fantasy points in 4 straight starts for Goedert. So go ahead and fire up Dallas Goedert. It is a strong matchup. The Rams allowing the 26 most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Remember, last week we really liked Hunter Henry against the Rams. I like Goddard a lot this week. I think he's a very strong start. Then we move along to the Rams. And last week I got a little bit of heat because I had Stafford as a sit, didn't feel overly excited about him. And he definitely came through against the New England Patriots with 27.8 fantasy points, 18 of 27, 295 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns. So I'm probably going to catch some heat again this week, but I do have an asterisk next to Stafford. I think he's startable, but the Eagles are allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. It's a very tough matchup, and they've also been very good against the run and very good against the wide receiver position. We talked about it in the wide receiver video. Like, I'm a little concerned about either Puka Nacua or Cooper Kupp this week because wide receiver ones are getting shut down right now by the Eagles. And for those reasons, I'm a little concerned about Stafford this week. Probably still startable, like super flex, double quarterback, but I'm not going out of my way to start Stafford. I'm a little concerned about this matchup, but he's still startable, has 18 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 starts. But, you know, you go back to week 10 against Miami, that was a very tough matchup for wide receivers and quarterbacks, and he only had 10 fantasy points. So I just have concerns this week, but let me know what you guys think. In terms of the tight end position, we did see a touchdown to Colby Parkinson this past week. He had 8.9 fantasy points, and we did see Davis Allen come back to earth and have no involvement in the offense, and so I don't know what to do with any of that information other than I'm not starting a Rams tight end in week 12. All right, to wrap up the week, we got a good Monday Night Football game. We're going to get the Ravens coming off of a loss, traveling to face the Chargers coming off of a slim victory. So let's start with the Ravens. Lamar Jackson gave you his worst fantasy performance of the season in Week 11, 16 of 33, 207 passing yards, a passing tutty, an interception, 46 yards on the ground. And it's another tough matchup this week against the Chargers. I know they didn't look so great against Joe Burrow and company, and they have moved back overall in rankings to 13th against the quarterback position, but they're still a good unit, don't get me wrong. But that doesn't really matter to me. It wouldn't matter who Lamar Jackson is facing. I will still start him every single week. So a little bit of a tough stretch here coming off of that poor performance and a tough game against Pittsburgh. Now he gets the Chargers and he gets the Eagles before a bye week. But don't lose your faith in Lamar Jackson. He's still going to be a great start. I would not lose my faith in Mark Andrews as well, coming off of a 4.2 fantasy performance this past week, and a tough matchup as the Chargers are giving up the 10th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. But, you know, I think with Andrews, I've been saying it over the past couple of weeks, like I got a lot of questions after the week 9, 4.6 performance. No, you just keep rolling with Andrews. He had 18.8 fantasy points the next week, 9.5 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2 since week 5, tight end 5 on the season. Just roll with the punches here. Keep starting Mark Andrews unless you have another option that you're overly confident in. Isaiah Likely saw some more involvement this past week. 5 targets, 4 catches, 75 receiving yards, a lost fumble, 9.5 fantasy points. Nice to see him show up again, make an appearance, but just not enough consistency here. I would never consider starting him until we see consistency after the awful things he did to us post week 1 against the Chiefs. All right, moving along here. The Chargers looking like one of the best teams in the NFL right now. Justin Herbert is throwing the football again. Let's not forget, I was very low on Herbert going into the season, coming off of the injury, got injured early in the year, and we knew this team was going to run the football first and foremost, and that's exactly how the beginning of the season played out. Justin Herbert was very limited. They ran the football a ton. They got an early bye week that they needed, and they really preserved Justin Herbert. And now they're kind of unleashing Justin Herbert, who definitely looks fully healthy. He's running the football. 9 rushing attempts in week 10, 5 for 65. This past week also had the rushing touchdown in week 10, but he's throwing the football a lot. I know week 10, a little bit limited in terms of numbers throwing the football, but outside of that, he has 27 or more passing attempts in every game since week 6. This past week, 17 of 36, 297 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 65 yards on the ground. Like we said, it did have a lost fumble, but oh well. 24.3 fantasy points, and this is a smash matchup against the Ravens, who are allowing the 30th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. This is a home game for the Chargers, primetime game, just like we saw last week. roll with Justin Herbert again. This is going to be a fun one. This is going to be another solid start for Justin Herbert. Then we look to the tight end position. Will Dissly, another tight end we talked about as a strong streaming option this past week. 6 targets, 4 catches, 80 receiving yards, a touchdown, 18 fantasy points, and he gets a smash matchup as well, as the Ravens are giving up the 24th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So Will Dissly at 29% rostered. That number is going to shoot up. Gets another good matchup in Week 13 against the Falcons, and another good matchup against the Chiefs, another good matchup against the Bucs. Will Dissly going to be a start for the next couple weeks, and he's a strong start here in Week 12. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single matchup, every single quarterback, every single tight end, and who you guys should be starting or sitting as we get into Week 12 of the season. As always, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comments section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into the week, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll get back to you guys before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. And as always, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content, because we're going to have everything you could possibly need here on the channel as the week progresses to help you dominate Week 12 of the fantasy season. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.